Our lives are just, well, so digital now, aren't they? Especially for young people.
Absolutely. It's their social space, their learning space.
Everything.
Yeah.
But there's a darker side, too, unfortunately. We hear a lot about it.
We do. And a big worry is how these negative online things, like cyberbullying, how they might connect to really serious mental health struggles.
Things like self-harm or even suicidal thoughts.
Exactly. That connection is deeply concerning.
It really is. And that's precisely what we're going to dig into today. We've got a really significant piece of research to guide us.
Yeah, this is a major review. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis. It was published back in 2018 in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, led by Anne John and her colleagues.
Okay, so they basically gathered up a whole load of studies that were already out there.
That's the idea. They wanted to combine all that existing evidence to get a clearer, sort of bigger picture of the link between cyberbullying being a victim, or doing the bullying and self-harm, or suicidal behaviors in kids and young adults.
A super study, then. So how do they actually manage that? And just how big are we talking here?
Well, a systematic review means they did a really thorough search, trying to find basically every relevant study published up to that point.
Okay.
And then the meta-analysis part, that's where they take the numbers, the statistical results, from all those studies and combine them mathematically.
To find an overall trend.
Exactly. It gives you a much stronger finding than just one study alone. And the scale here was pretty impressive. They ended up including 33 different articles.
33.
Which came from 26 separate independent studies. And all told, that covered data from over 156,000 young people.
Wow. 156,000. That's a lot of people.
It really is, mostly under 25.
And what kind of studies were these mostly? Were they following kids over years or more like snapshots?
Good question. The review mentions that most of them were cross-sectional.
Okay, so snapshots.
Yeah, think of it like taking a picture at one point in time, asking kids, are you being cyberbullied? And have you had thoughts of self-harm recently around the same time?
Right, so that shows if the two things are happening together.
Precisely. It shows an association, a link. But it's tricky, because it can't definitively prove that the cyberbullying caused the self-harm. Or which came first.
Got it. Association, not necessarily causation. That's important. How did they define cyberbullying across all these different studies and these outcomes, self-harm and suicidal behavior? Did they manage to standardize that?
They tried to stick to common ground. So cyberbullying was generally defined as, aggressive, intentional acts repeated over time using electronic means, phones, internet, that kind of thing.
Okay, makes sense.
And for the outcomes, self-harm was defined as intentionally hurting oneself, like injury or poisoning, but not fatally. Suicidal behaviors was broader, covering thoughts about suicide, making plans, and also actual attempts. One thing the review notes is that many studies kind of grouped these outcomes together or didn't separate out, say, mild thoughts from serious attempts. So that adds a layer of, let's say, fuzziness when you combine everything.
Okay, understood. So let's get to the core findings then. After crunching all the numbers from those 156,000 young people, what did the meta-analysis actually show? What were the main links?
Okay, this is where it gets pretty stark. They used a statistic called an odds ratio, an OR.
Right. You mentioned that. Remind us quickly what that means.
Sure. It's basically a measure of how much more likely one group is to experience something compared to another group. So an OR of 2 means twice as likely.
Okay. Lay the numbers on us. What did they find for victims of cyberbullying?
All right. So compared to young people who were not being cyberbullied, those who were victims, well, they were found to be 2.35 times more likely to self-harm.
Okay. More than double the odds.
Yeah. And 2.90 times more likely to show suicidal behaviors in general.
Double.
And when they looked just at suicide attempts, it was even higher, 2.57 times more likely.
Wow.
And for suicidal thoughts, specifically, 2.15 times more likely.
So across the board, being cyberbullied is linked to a really significantly higher risk of these terrible outcomes.
That's exactly what the data suggests. These aren't small increases. They're substantial and statistically very significant. Highly unlikely to be just chance.
That's heavy. Now, you mentioned they also looked at the perpetrators, the ones doing the cyberbullying.
They did. And this was also quite revealing, actually.
How so?
The risk increase wasn't as high as for the victims, but it was still there. It was still statistically significant.
Okay.
So compared to kids not involved in bullying, those who perpetrated cyberbullying were 1.21 times more likely to exhibit suicidal behaviors.
Also higher.
And 1.23 times more likely to report having suicidal thoughts or ideation.
So it's not just the targets who are struggling. Engaging in this behavior is also linked to increased risk for the person doing it. That adds a whole other dimension, doesn't it?
It really does. It complicates the picture beyond just victim and bully.
Now, something else that often comes up is the overlap with traditional bullying, like face-to-face stuff.
Mm.
Did the review look at how that fits in? Because surely lots of kids experience both, right?
Absolutely. That's a critical point. And yes, the researchers tried to untangle that a bit with more detailed analyses. It's a bit complex.
Okay.
In some analyses, when they statistically controlled for whether someone was also being bullied traditionally, the link between just the cyberbullying part and self-harm or suicidal outcomes actually seemed to get stronger.
Stronger. So cyberbullying might have its own unique, powerful negative impact, separate from traditional bullying.
That's one interpretation, yeah. It suggests it's not just more the same. However,
There's always a however in
Exactly.
research, isn't there?
yeah, usually. Other analyses, what they called meta-regressions, hinted at something else. In studies where traditional bullying was very common in that population,
Right.
the additional impact specifically from cyberbullying seemed relatively smaller. So maybe the context matters a lot. If traditional bullying is rampant, perhaps cyberbullying, while still bad, doesn't add as much extra risk compared to situations where traditional bullying is less common.
Okay, so it's nuanced. It's not a simple add-on effect, maybe.
It might not be. And some studies they included did find a cumulative effect, like being bullied both ways was worse than just one. So the interaction is definitely complex.
Right, okay. So we've got these really strong links, especially for victims, but also for perpetrators, and this complex interplay with traditional bullying. What does this all mean in practical terms? What should we be doing with this information?
I think the biggest takeaway for action is just how serious this is. The risks connected to cyberbullying, for self-harm, for suicidal thoughts, these are significant real-world harms for young people.
So for, say, schools or policymakers.
The review really pushes for cyberbullying prevention to be right up there, a major priority, alongside traditional bullying prevention.
What does that look like?
Things like really robust programs on using the internet safely, digital citizenship, being a good person online, and also teaching kids how to support peers, how to spot if someone's struggling, and what to do.
And what about for individuals? For young people themselves or for parents, carers?
Well, one really worrying point the source makes is that kids who are cyberbullied are often less likely to ask for help than kids bullied face-to-face.
Really? Why might that be? Shame, maybe? Or not knowing who to tell?
Could be lots of reasons. But it means we absolutely have to double down on encouraging them to talk, making it clear it's okay, it's important to reach out to someone they trust, a parent, a teacher, a counselor, and making sure they actually know how to get help.
That makes sense. What about for professionals, like doctors or therapists working with kids?
The review suggests they should probably be routinely asking about cyberbullying experiences. It should be part of the standard conversation when assessing a young person's mental health.
Like a standard screening question.
Exactly. And if a young person is involved, either side, victim or perpetrator, that's a flag. A flag to then screen more carefully for mental health problems, for self-harm risk. And the study also points out maybe professionals need more specific training on this too.
And going back to that finding about perpetrators also being at risk, how does the review suggest we think about that? It's not just about discipline.
Right. It shifts the focus. Maybe the kid doing the cyberbullying isn't just acting out or being malicious. Maybe they're also vulnerable. Maybe they're struggling themselves.
Yeah.
Their behavior could be a sign they need support, not just consequences. The review even mentions things like, could feelings of guilt be playing a role in their own increased risk? It suggests we need interventions that help everyone involved, not just the victims. And maybe tailor things. Perhaps there are differences for boys and girls in these pathways.
It's such a comprehensive look because it pulls so much together. But like you said, no research is perfect. What were some of the limitations the authors themselves pointed out? Where do we still need more information?
Yeah, they were quite clear on the limitations, which is good science. The big one we already touched on is the cross-sectional nature of most
That
studies.
snapshot thing.
Exactly. It shows strong links, strong associations, but it just cannot prove from that design alone that cyberbullying caused the self-harm or suicidal thoughts.
Can't draw that direct causal arrow.
Correct. And related to that is the issue of reverse causality.
What's that?
It's the chicken and egg problem. Could be that young people who are already struggling with their mental health, maybe they're depressed, anxious, already having these difficult thoughts, are somehow more likely to get drawn into cyberbullying situations. Maybe they become targets more easily, or maybe their own struggles lead them to act out and bully others.
Ah, okay. So the mental health issue might come first, and the cyberbullying involvement follows.
It's possible. These studies mostly couldn't rule that out.
What other limitations were there?
Well, how things were measured varied quite a bit. Different studies used slightly different definitions of cyberbullying, or they measured outcomes like self-harm with maybe just a single question, or grouped mild and severe cases together.
Right, the fuzziness you mentioned.
Yeah, and that variation between studies leads to what researchers call high heterogeneity. Basically, the results from individual studies bounced around quite a bit. So while the combined average tells a story, you have to remember there's a lot of variability underneath that average number. It makes the single OR figure a bit, harder to interpret definitively.
And did the studies account for other things going on in a young person's life, like pre-existing conditions or family stuff?
That's another key point. Many didn't fully account for other known risk factors. Things like, did the young person already have depression? Were they also being bullied traditionally? What was their family situation like? These are all linked to self-harm and suicide risk independently.
So it's hard to isolate the unique effect of just the cyberbullying.
Exactly. It's hard to know how much is the cyberbullying itself versus these other contributing factors that weren't always measured or controlled for.
And you mentioned the data on perpetrators was maybe less solid?
Yeah, there just weren't as many studies focusing specifically on perpetrators compared to victims. And the review noted that the quality of those perpetrator studies tended to be a bit lower overall. So the findings for perpetrators, while important and concerning, are based on a somewhat less robust evidence base.
So understanding these limitations isn't about dismissing the review, is it? It's more about pointing the way forward for future research.
Precisely. The authors use these limitations to say, okay, here's what we need next. We need studies with clear, consistent definitions. We need better validated ways to measure both cyberbullying and these sensitive outcomes.
And crucially,
We need longitudinal studies, studies that follow the same group of young people over time.
to see the order of events.
Yes. To see if the cyberbullying typically happens before the mental health problems emerge, or vice versa, that would give us much better clues about causality and the pathways involved. We also need more research digging into specifics like, does the type of cyberbullying matter? How often does it happen? Are there differences for boys versus girls? What about protective factors? What helps kids cope? And really understanding why the psychological mechanisms underneath it all.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, if there's one main message to take away.
I think it's this. The evidence we have pulled together from a huge amount of research shows a strong, consistent link between being a victim of cyberbullying and a significantly higher risk of self-harm and suicidal behaviors in young people. That link is clear. And there's also a concerning, though less studied, link for those who perpetrate cyberbullying too.
Yeah. So for you listening, as you think about your own online life, or about the kids and teenagers in your world, your children, family, students, community members, this really highlights how incredibly important it is to pay attention. Their online world and their emotional health are deeply intertwined. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Technology changes so fast, doesn't it? New apps, new platforms, new ways kids connect, and, sadly, new ways they can hurt each other online. Given that pace, how do we make sure that our research, our prevention work in schools, our support systems, how do we ensure they aren't just constantly trying to catch up, but are actually relevant, accessible, and genuinely effective for the digital reality young people are living in right now?